I want to welcome you all to today's discussion and conversation about recent political developments in Egypt. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that for the last several weeks, Egypt has been on a kind of roller coaster ride in a very turbulent period with all kinds of developments, culminating, of course, in the announcement, the drawn-out announcement last weekend of Mohamed Morsi's election as the new president of the Republic. Now, we don't know if his election is going to calm things down and stabilize the situation, of course, because the Supreme Council of the Armed Forces have undertaken a number of moves that complicate the situation considerably and appear to lessen the powers of the president. They've also suspended the parliament and taken a whole bunch of moves, which I will let the panelists elaborate on, which call into question whether they really intend to give up power or not. Tomorrow there's supposed to be a million-man march in downtown Cairo, and Saturday is supposed to be the inauguration, so very interesting times ahead. Originally, we were scheduled to have with us today members of the Freedom and Justice Party to discuss the elections, but as recently as last Friday, they were committed to coming, but given the developments of the last week or so, they unfortunately had to cancel. But we're very, very lucky in that we have three superb experts with us today who can talk about what's going on in Cairo, what it means for the future, how is the new president going to deal with all the different actors in Egypt, ranging from the SCAF to liberal, secular activists, and everybody in between. And we're going to have the conversation moderated today by Middle East Institute scholar and head of Freedom House's Middle East Division, Charles Dunn. Our three panelists today are Hafez Al Mirazi. He's visiting from Cairo, where he's director of the Kamal Adham Center for Television and Digital Journalism at the American University in Cairo. He's here taping shows for a program he hosts called Cairo Time, which is a current affairs show on Dream TV in Egypt. He was, as many of you know, previously Al Jazeera's Washington bureau chief. Khaled Elgindy is a visiting fellow at the Brookings Institution and a founding member of the Egyptian American Rule of Law Association. He most recently served with the Negotiation Support Unit in Ramallah as an advisor to the Palestinian leadership on permanent status negotiations. And, of course, Nathan Brown is a professor of political science and international affairs at George Washington University and a non-resident senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He is the author of the book, When Victory is Not an Option, Islamist Movements in Arab Politics, and among many other publications. I believe, Nathan, you have some flyers about the book outside that you can pick up on the way out. We also have a table outside with membership information about the Middle East Institute. Just like public broadcasting, we depend on the support of our audience and our supporters and our private individuals like you. So pick up membership information on your way out as well. So I want to thank all of our panelists for agreeing to come here today to talk about this extremely captivating topic. Charles?
Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks, Phil, and I'd like to thank the Middle East Institute for arranging this event and to Carnegie for hosting us in this very nice facility here. As Phil said, Egypt, as we've all seen in the news, has been going through a period of political turmoil. First, we've seen the first election of a civilian president in Egypt's history, and a Muslim Brotherhood president at that. And what that really signifies to me is that we are at the beginning of a power struggle that has been going on for some time in Egypt, but it's really going to be intensifying right now. Egyptians are going to have to answer a number of supremely important questions in the next few months, and they're going to have to do so within a very compressed political timeline. These questions include the makeup of the cabinet and the Constituent Assembly that will be charged with drafting the Constitution. When will new elections for a new parliament take place, and under what circumstances and rules will they take place? And once the Constitution is drafted, will the powers that be require a rerun of the presidential election itself, as some members of the military have been hinting? One thing seems certain, despite the planned transfer of power ceremony on June 30th, the SCAF really won't return to the barracks and the officers' club as promised. They'll still be very much a force to be reckoned with in Egyptian politics. But beyond that, many things are unclear. As Nathan here has written very recently, the recent events have left Egypt's institutional arrangements in a great deal of disarray. And the gaps in these arrangements are likely to be filled in coming months during the political rough and tumble among interactions among the various parties, whether unilaterally by the SCAF or by the courts, possibly even by the presidency, or perhaps in the outcome of street struggles between the political powers and the revolutionary forces. So to help us make sense of where Egypt is and where it might be going, I'd like to thank our three panelists in advance. I'm going to start by asking a few general questions, and I think we'll start with Hafez. We've had, obviously, a very close runoff in the political presidential election in an atmosphere of highly charged political views. By all accounts, it was a peaceful election. It was relatively transparent. But it took place against a profoundly undemocratic background of unilateral declarations by the military and so on. I'd just like to ask you how Egyptians are reacting to the political developments and how you see the mood in the country.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and thanks for the opportunity. By the way, I'm here replacing but not representing the Muslim brothers. only share with them the B as a small letter, not capital letter, as a brother. It's really significant what happened in Egypt, and important because the backdrop of the runoff in the elections, some people were so cynical about the results, although everybody knew the figures. The results is going to be 13.2 for Morsi, 12.3 for Shafiq. Yet people felt that something might happen, and it's a nightmare if it happens, if they declare yet that Shafiq is the winner. And some people even had this tough choice between making sure that Morsi, representing civil society, a new era for Egypt, a second republic, or it is the first and last elections as long as he is a Muslim Brotherhood, and we're not sure if we're going to witness that again once the guy is in power. But fortunately, really, what we have witnessed is that at the last few days before announcing the elections, we have found some kind of national unity from secular groups, leftists, liberals, except maybe few of them. But the majority of them, or a significant part of secular and liberals who were against any chance of voting for an Islamist to be in power, they all went and collided together because the idea was, and the struggle was not about Islamist against civilian. It is about military versus civilian. And so for that reason, everybody looked at it as the end of era of military rule of Egypt for over 60 years. So that is not something that we could belittle or consider it is taken for granted. The second thing actually is that people feel that they are still in the camp of Morsi, regardless of the ideology of who is supporting Morsi right now, until the end, whatever left of powers that the SCAF retained for themselves before handing power to Morsi. And that's something else that is very important. In addition to the numbers of 52 versus 48, or approximately that figures, this is something that is not heard of in the whole region. And we ended up of the soft power of example that is going to resonate in the whole region and in the whole area. So Egyptians feel proud of what they have achieved. Part of the chants on January 25 and the 18 days of revolution was dignity, was part of it. So liberty, dignity, and social justice were the three things mainly that people were chanting for in order to, that ended with ousting Mubarak. And they felt that part of dignity is that they managed to get rid of a retired general, despite all what they said about civilian society or anything like that, and they felt that they really empowered once again.
Thank you. Khaled, I'd like to drill down on this question about the liberals and the seculars just a little bit more. They seemed, by most accounts, to have split their votes between Morsi and Shafiq, voting for either one of them for different reasons. But their way forward in this present political environment is somewhat unclear. And just today, the campaigns of Khaled Ali and Amr Moussa, several others, announced that they were forming a movement, what they call the third movement, which they hope will be a movement that will fill in the middle ground between the two poles of the Islamists and the military. And what I'd like to ask you is, what are the chances of success for such a movement in Egypt today? And if you don't see that as a viable alternative, what is the way forward for these parties who seem somewhat left out in the election?
Well, I mean, it's a good question. And I think, of course, it's very difficult to predict anything with regard to Egypt. But I will say that I think there's been a lot of lessons learned on the part of all of these groups, including the so-called liberal, secular, revolutionary, whatever we're calling them. I think they have learned certain lessons, but other lessons haven't quite been internalized. Assuming that they do go ahead and form a third way type of movement, I think in the absence of a consensus, at least among that group, that very disparate, diverse group of non-Islamists, I think it would be difficult for them to really succeed, because as Hafez pointed out, that segment, that constituency, is currently split. It is largely, perhaps a majority, in the Morsi camp for now, and some of them are outside. Some voted for Shafiq, some spoiled their ballots. I think until they can actually bring all of this disparate groups together, I don't see that happening in the near term. But one of the interesting things about this whole electoral process, and now we've seen Egyptians go to the polls on 5 different occasions, is that with each round of voting, we learn a little bit more about the political landscape in Egypt. The political map becomes clear, and I think there's a real value in this. And I think this is certainly so useful for us, outsiders and analysts, to look at how things evolve. But it's most useful, of course, for the Egyptian actors themselves, to learn which constituencies voted in which way. And one of the more interesting thing is that we've always referred to this non-Islamist group, for lack of a better term, as liberals or as secularists or something. And one thing we've seen is at least a little bit more clarification on what this group, which is really, of course, several subgroups, consists of. And now we know that there is a constituency that prioritizes fighting against the regime, against the military. And then there is a contingency that is actually less concerned with the military than they are with Islamists. Whether they're a minority or not, I think it's very hard to know the actual numbers. But at least we're getting a little bit more clarity.
Right, and I suppose that one of the big tests is going to be whether they can actually organize themselves and get a ground game going like the Muslim Brotherhood has, and so effectively in the elections.
Right, and if the recent past is any indication, then I would say that the odds are probably not that favorable.
Right. Nathan, I'd like to pull the focus back a little bit onto the Arab world and the international community in general. Do you think the results of the presidential election are going to encourage or discourage the kind of support among the EU, the Arab world, and the United States, very importantly, that will really help Egypt now address its serious internal problems?
I think in some sense that process has gone much better than people would have expected. If you had said back in February when Mubarak resigned that in a year and a half you'll have President Mohamed Morsi, and a sort of a brotherhood as a leading political actor in Egypt, I think people would have been very, very nervous. And what has happened over the past year has been absolutely remarkable. First, on the part of, I would say, I'm focusing first in the United States, on the Obama administration of saying essentially, they repeated this like a mantra, this is not about us, this is not about us. We'll have to take the Egyptian political scene as it is, and really making an effort beginning about a year ago, last summer, to slowly reach out to the Muslim Brotherhood, and the Brotherhood did the same thing. It tried to figure out what it had to say to the United States, and it very quickly figured it out, and it quickly said those words. The words that the Americans wanted to hear. I think it was very difficult for the movement, and in fact, the movement has had a much less easy time reassuring domestic audiences. But the Americans, they managed to at least reassure as much as was possible. The Europeans, it's the same sort of thing. The issues are, I think, perceived a little bit different. The concerns when you talk to European officials, they will probably emphasize much more women's rights and much less Israel, but it's the same kind of concerns. And again, the Brotherhood has learned how to speak a language that is a little bit more reassuring. The Arab world is, of course, I think, very, very different. And you've got some governments in the Arab world that are extremely concerned, and you've got some government, or sometimes some governments and sometimes some populations, most particularly in Gaza, that look with tremendous hope. They're not necessarily in a position to help. So internationally, I think this has had many fewer repercussions. But the question you asked is it going to allow the international community, or is the international community going to be able to step in and help? And that's not my expertise, but I would say if that's what the Egyptians are counting on, they had the revolution at the wrong time. I mean, in the middle of an incredible global financial crisis, it seems to me that any kind of talk of massive international financial assistance is just not going to happen.
Thank you. I'd like to take a look now at Mohammed Morsi and his immediate steps as he comes into the presidential palace. And I'd like to ask Hafez about Morsi and his cabinet formation process. Now, he's promised to put into place a very diverse cabinet, including as many as 6 vice presidents. He's promised to include women. He's promised to include Copts. He's presumably promised to even include members of these more liberal parties as well. A couple of questions related to this. First of all, do you think such a diverse cabinet is going to be any different from the kind of tokenism that we saw when Mubarak appointed many of these same types to his cabinet? They didn't exercise much influence, but he could point to them by saying, "I have appointed members of these different groups." And another question related to this is, do you think that if Morsi tried to appoint some real political heavyweights, I don't think talks with Mohammed Baradei were successful to bring him in. There's Amr Moussa as well. But if he brought in some real political heavyweights and enjoyed broad popular support, do you think this would help increase his legitimacy and, more importantly, give him more leverage in dealing with SCAF?
Well, of course it would be smart to do it from politics point of view, not really to achieve something. To get someone who's a political figure recognized like Al-Baradei or Amr Moussa might shift any blame to this guy. If it fails, look what Amr Moussa did or Baradei did. And Baradei, of course, today they confirmed that he did decline without being asked, but he did request if they would like to have a prime minister, and he didn't want to do a prime minister. For Morsi, with his background, knowing that what matters is really the achievement of what you need to do, not the charisma or anything. He himself, his victory is an example of charisma doesn't matter. So I believe the difference between getting cosmetic changes and some figures are saying this guy is called the Coptic or his job is to be Coptic, and this lady is her job is to be a female minister or whatever, is not going to work in Egypt after January 25th. To the contrary, you have time bombs in each appointment that you have, because each one of them is looking for the lights to be spotted on them and the microphones and announce a resignation in front of everybody, working for the next presidential campaign to be one of the runners against whoever appointed him. So I think it is going to be real appointment that people who could deliver. The challenge is going to be the percentage of how many people are you getting from outside, how many in. How many people are going to really understand the teamwork, and they are not here in order to make a point and then leave after a few days or weeks. So that's why I feel it's very tough. The problem is that if we increase the number of vice presidents or whatever, that is diluting the whole thing. I mean, talking about 2 or 3 maximum would be understandable in Egypt, given this is what Nasser used to have before electing or choosing Sadat to be his first vice president instead of only one vice president. But other than that, I think it's going to be tough. What usually would do, maybe look for someone as a technocrat, especially with an economist with this background, he would look for. But I don't really expect anything as that he will go for a charismatic person, and in the same time, he's not going for cosmetic and just a figurehead to appease people. It's not going to be enough. It's going to be tough, and the choice of those people are really going to be a test of how this guy is really genuine in making any changes.
And of course, he's been told that certain of the key ministries are simply off limits to pick, including defense and interior and so on.
Yeah, I think mainly the defense, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Do you suppose any other?
But the interior, no. I mean, everything is open for him to choose, only the defense minister. And for him, given the age issue, he's going to have that into consideration to keep the defense minister as of respect for seniority. Yeah.
And just one quick follow-up. Do you think how much influence do you think SCAF will have on the other appointments behind this?
Not much. I mean, yesterday they talked for the first time. 2 of the members of the SCAF gave an interview, TV interview. And they talked about that it is going all to the president. They kept saying president many times or more than they mentioned the field marshal who was their boss. So what is left for the SCAF, although it might look really that someone is taking authority or powers of the president, is the first one is about the declaring war, that has to be consent with them. And I wonder when was the last time Egypt under 3 presidents did declare war with anyone or did get in war. So that is relief for the Muslim Brotherhood, that they can always blame it on the military, that they failed to do it. And the asking for them to intervene in any riots or disturbance inside, and it is always will be their call. Even if the law would say, yes, you can do, but you could always have excuses not to do it. So actually, it is not really much, but the fact that there is powers kept for the military is for the benefit of Morsi, because now he has national unity for so many people still struggling on behalf of Morsi, and not necessarily because they like Morsi, against the military. So it is, for the time being, it is working for his behalf.
Thank you. Khaled, President-elect Morsi met Tuesday with a delegation from the Coptic Orthodox Church, including the Pope, and he reportedly told the Pope that he was not going to allow anybody to condescend to Copts in their own country. He was going to maintain close relations, close ties with both the church and the Coptic community in general. But, other than appointing a Coptic Christian to a ministerial post, what else do you think the president could do to assure the Coptic community that their rights and privileges in the country will be respected? And for example, do you think there's any possibility that a Christian could contend under a Morsi presidency for a senior post in the military or the security sector?
Well, assuming that Morsi would have a say in who gets appointed to a senior post in the military, I think this is one of the key litmus tests for Morsi's presidency. And there are, of course, there are lots of things on the table that Copts and human rights activists and those advocating on behalf of a basic principle of equal citizenship before the law, there's a lot that's already been put on the table. You could have, for example, a unified law on dealing with houses of worship. That's been on the table. It's probably not likely. It's not something that the Brotherhood is going to endorse. But there are there are things out there. I think one basic thing is to maintain a consistent line of communication with Copts. And I think this is going to be a real challenge for Mohammed Morsi and for the Brotherhood itself. I mean, this goes against the culture within the Brotherhood that is very majoritarian, that is very, to the extent that they acknowledge diversity or pluralism, it is in very tokenistic terms. They have, of course, a Coptic member of their political party, the FJP, who's the Deputy Secretary General, or I forget his exact post. But this is really very much in the tradition of tokenism. So I think that he probably will be one of the most scrutinized people in all of Egypt, because you'll have revolutionaries looking at him, you'll have Copts judging his every move. Any indication that he's moving towards an Islamist agenda versus a national agenda, I think will be called out immediately. So that's one good thing, I would say. And that probably also will constrain him a little bit. I think he, in addition to intensifying his outreach to Copts, and hopefully kind of rise above the Brotherhood per se, as it may be, the institution that that made him, and from whence he came. But he's going to have to rise above that sort of partisanship and parochialism. And I think it'll be a learning process for him as well. I think other things like strengthening the rule of law, strengthening, the judiciary. Of course, you need a functioning parliament to undertake a lot of these reforms. But to the extent that he can show a commitment to these types of reforms, I think is very important, and not simply rhetorical ones. Because again, the Brotherhood has a history of saying all the right things. They've got excellent talking points, but when it comes to operationalizing these ideas, that's where they've fallen short. So I think there are a lot that he can do, and if he can't think of things to do, I'm absolutely certain that others in Egyptian society will be there to remind him.
Thanks. Actually, that's a great segue into the question that I would like to ask of Nathan. You spoke of operationalizing, many of these ideas that are out there, and I think that's going to be key. And it seems that there are two big issues on the Egyptians' minds that express themselves in the presidential elections: the security issue, of course, and the economy. And what I'd like to ask you, Nathan, is how do you assess Morsi's agenda in both of these areas? Do you think they are, first of all, identifiable? Does he have one? Are they realistic, and are they achievable? And do you think that he has a realistic possibility to make progress, to operationalize some of these programs? Or do you think SCAF has really set him up for failure?
Those are great questions which I'm incompletely qualified to answer. But I'll try. But before I do that, I want to compensate for my lack of expertise by just commenting on a point that's already come up that I think both Hafez and Khaled both talked about, in a sense, the empty symbolism of appointing a Copt or a woman vice president. I think if I were, say, an Egyptian Christian, that's exactly how I would regard it. I mean, right now they've got very real concerns that they're about to be excluded from public life. There are real concerns about safety and security and so on, and a token appointment would be unreassuring because they would expect it to be reassuring. That's not what they're looking for from the perspective of those groups. From the perspective of the Brotherhood, however, an appointment as vice president would be huge. And let me explain why, I think. The Brotherhood had a big argument about 6 or 7 years ago about qualifications for the presidency. And the faction within the Brotherhood that argued that essentially those qualifications in traditional Islamic jurisprudence in order to be a political leader, including being a male Muslim, still applied for Egypt today. And therefore, no Coptic woman could be qualified. They tried to soften that position because it caused real controversy. They said, well, of course, we'd accept one that was legitimately elected, but our own position is we'd never nominate one, and so forth and so on. In the Constitutional Declaration, it says explicitly, in order to become a vice president, first there's some succession mechanisms. If something happens to the president, one of these vice presidents, if there's half a dozen, I don't know how they choose, would step in, but you have to have the same qualifications for the presidency. One real big question for the Brotherhood is, it's got these general ideological commitments, but it's going to have to start making political decisions. And if he took that step, I think it would not necessarily mean anything to anybody outside the movement. Inside the movement, it would be a very clear message. Short-term political considerations dominate. We have basically just given up something that we said was a fixed position of the movement because it was politically convenient. It would be huge in ideological terms, a real indication of where the Brotherhood is going. Now, that was the easy question. Now the economy. Let me answer the question for the Brotherhood, because Morsi himself is a little bit of a cipher on this. He's an engineer, not an economist, and he's an organization man, and not one who's developed a distinctive view and a distinctive voice on policy issues that's separate from that of the Brotherhood. The Brotherhood is got, in the economic realm, I think, three impulses. One is kind of populist, the social justice. You've got a poor society. You've got a real kind of sense that Egyptians have real material problems, and they're calling on the Brotherhood to help satisfy them. And so things like minimum wage and those sorts of things really force themselves on the agenda. Subsidies and so forth and so on. Employment, housing, health, public services. So they've got that impulse. They've got a second that says, we're an Islamic movement, and there's certain kind of Islamic or Sharia-compliant finance and economic enterprises, and we certainly want to foster those. And then they've got kind of this free market, almost Washington consensus impulse. What we have heard from the Brotherhood since the revolution is, of course, we still believe number one, and we still believe number two, but right now Egypt needs number three. It really needs, essentially, fundamentally a liberal economic policy, one that doesn't forget the poor, one that still constructs a friendly environment for Islamic or Sharia-compliant finance and so on. But right now, what we want is, they wouldn't call it this, but they would essentially the economic policy of the last 10 years implemented in a clean and non-corrupt manner without favoritism, with kind of capitalism without the crony part of it. That's the message that they've been trying to send to the external audience. And you read their platforms. A lot of them are vague, but that seems to be their impulse. Will they have the power to implement it? I wouldn't go quite as far as Hafez did in terms of how much the military has restricted itself. But it seems to me that when it comes to domestic issues, when it comes to questions of administration, public services, economic policy, and so on, for the most part, the military seems to be saying that's places for the civilian authorities. We're very happy to hand those things off to President Morsi. And so I think those will be the areas where his constraints will be more in terms of popular pressure, high popular expectations, the kind of coalition that he's got to put together. How does he pursue liberal economic policy when he's got socialists in the cabinet, and that sort of thing. But in terms of the military, yeah, I think he's got, I won't say a blank check, but an awful lot of leeway in that area.
And also, if I may add, in this regard, today, the outgoing government, the caretaking government of Ganzouri, they announced that they signed with the International Islamic Bank a loan for $1 billion with the interest of, I think, 3.5. So the word of Islamic Bank, interest, accepting interest, which is not supposed to be the word, accepting interest in loaning people, 3 point something. So there is, we're talking about the same international terms and modern terms. No, whatever the use of Sharia or the reservation or anything like that, that doesn't really prevent them from doing business as usual. And I think that shouldn't affect their way of trying to do something to improve the economy. The stock market today in Egypt closed for the whole week with over 15% increase, so making up most of the losses that happened at the beginning of the week before announcing the results of the victory of Morsi, and including ups and downs in the way that there was debate where Morsi is going to swear in or anything like that. So things are moving and he's not perceived as a socialist. So some of the candidates like Hamdin Sabahi, that people would have loved if the third ranking one would have come and be the winner. We would have had Hamdin Sabahi been the winner now and won, the secular one. I think the markets and the economy would have really reacted in a totally different way, negative way, compared to the Islamist Morsi in power.
Thank you. Sort of a related question. We talked about the SCAF and how we'll try to, whether it's given Morsi enough leeway to succeed. But I'm also interested in how Egypt's deep state is going to take this. I mean, one of the things about the revolution, obviously, is that huge parts of the state security apparatus, state media and so on, many of the ministries in some cases run by holdovers of the Mubarak government, have tried to either elect former NDP people like Shafiq or in other ways tried to maintain control of their power and privileges. So Hafez, and anybody else would like to comment on this, how do you think both SCAF and the so-called deep state in Egypt will play politically in this interim period before new parliamentary elections and while the Constitution is drafted? How are they likely to maneuver, presumably to maintain their authorities and privileges, but maybe to see if Morsi can be given a chance to succeed?
Yeah, Khaled? Okay. Today, another example I'd like to give, just if we're talking about the deep state and the security apparatus. Today in the news, people started to talk how come that the youngest son of the president-elect, Morsi, has been escorted by secret police, secret service, to take his final exam in high school, at the end of high school, with a black limousine. And something, are we repeating back the days of Mubarak and his sons and all of that stuff? Of course, we have to be sympathetic with him because the son is an American citizen, born American, as one of two of his three kids, three boys, were born in California while he was here. But in any case, of course, there will be the corrupting image of someone using the security apparatus, the same privileges of being the president that might alienate some people, the same way that happened with the parliament. So the security and the deep state might not do it the flagrant way and the dumb way of getting into confrontation and deprive him from privileges. To the contrary, we are worried that they might give him too much privileges to enjoy in order to look like Mubarak, and is no different. And this is the guy you choose, because the Speaker of the House in Egypt did exactly while he was running business of the parliament as the predecessor Fathi Surur did with them, dealing with people that this guy, you shut him up, or the one to speak, or the one to talk, and all of that stuff. So I believe the corrupting influence of giving the image of Morsi as just another one using all the slogans of revolution, and at the meantime is another tyrant in process. I think that is the most thing that we would worry about. Other than that, the police is going to cooperate as much as they could. They believe that this guy could deliver for them better than General Shafiq, because General Shafiq was promising people in 1 week, I'm going to bring security to Egypt, without promising them anything in return, as if it's his right as a general that I'm going to order you. The police now is seeing that Shafiq has to pay for them, for increasing and improving their social standards, so social living and things like that. So in general, I'm not worried. The only thing left is about the state police, the secret police, and the documents, and how soon, when Morsi is going to ask to know of what happened before. Whether it's about himself, whether about people against him and opponents. And I think that is going to be the case at least for the next year, until we finish with the Constitution.
Mm-hmm. Well, Khaled, let me ask you. I mean, What do you think the prospects are for accountability of the previous regime as Morsi settles into the presidency and so on? And in a number of other countries, Tunisia, where, for example, Freedom House is working on a major transitional justice project, that seems to be a major need in these countries undergoing transformations. Do you think there are real prospects for a genuine transitional justice program in Egypt going forward? And what do you think the time frame might be?
It's a very good question, and I think transitional justice is something that is desperately needed, actually. I think it's very important. It's why they call it transitional justice. I mean, it's very important to allow for a transition. You know, part of being able to move forward is, on some level, dealing with your past. And I think, I think to a certain extent, a lot of the kind of cyclical nature of the dynamics of the last 16 months is precisely because of these unresolved issues of accountability. I've asked Brotherhood folks about this question of transitional justice, and again, they say they've looked into it, they're looking into it, they've traveled to South Africa and other places to study different models. I don't know how serious they are about it. It's clearly not one of their bread and butter issues. I think also there is a prevailing culture in Egypt, let's say mainly among the political class and the establishment, against what people refer to as revenge and digging up the past. And I've heard this from, for example, Amr Musa's campaign and others, and even so-called liberals who are much more concerned about either their own political prospects in the immediate and short term or the economic situation than they are with mass prosecutions and so forth. But the nature of transitional justice itself is that the whole idea is that you strike a balance between accountability for the past and being able to move forward. You're not going to have mass prosecutions and mass purges. But you do need some kind of accountability for the crimes of financial crimes, but also the violence that was inflicted, the political, the repression in political terms, the torture that was used systematically. There needs to be some accounting, at least in order to know which areas need reform. And if there's a significant movement towards that, I think it will be reassuring for a lot of folks, especially some of the young, revolutionary types. But again, I think the dire economic situation and the security situation, as well as limitations on what Morsi can do, and that a lot of these kinds of reforms will have to be enacted by a functioning parliament, which we don't have. There's a lot that needs to happen before we even get to that stage. But if I could maybe just make a point on the deep state, I think it will actually be very hard to kind of push back the deep state. It's why they call it a deep state and not a shallow state, because if it was a shallow state, it would be easy to replace or dismantle. But the deep state is problematic because of the opaqueness. It's going to be a challenge because of the opaqueness. It's very difficult to know the exact relationship between these various institutions that are semi-autonomous. It is, and also there are very firmly entrenched vested interests. The military, of course, has an interest in self-preservation, and they have very substantial economic interests as well. The exact numbers we don't know. So the deep state really is not something that can be reformed with an act of parliament or through legislation or a series of reforms. It's something that is really going to take quite a bit of time to dismantle, or at least to roll back in certain areas and probably in phases. But I think one of the additional challenges to doing that is the fact that you now have a member of the Muslim Brotherhood and possibly others from whatever coalition he puts together who are going to establish a government And a certain level of the political class, including some who might identify as revolutionary, have now a vested interest in something that resembles the status quo. So they have a presidency and its cabinet and whatever the limits are on the exact limits of its power, you are now a stakeholder in this thing called the status quo, which is a tactic, I think, that the SCAF and the deep state has used quite effectively. The best way to preserve the status quo is to give everyone else a stake in it. And it's one of the things, I think it's one of the traps that groups like the Muslim Brotherhood have fallen into. And so it's going to be a very difficult balancing act between pushing on the SCAF and pushing for actual reforms and resisting the temptation, as Hafez said, not just for the outward, the optics of privilege, but actual privilege. The fact that you have actual power, that you have positions, people in positions of authority and influence on how resources are allocated. And, all of that can be corrupting with a small c, in the sense of, not necessarily that I'm benefiting illicitly from it, but in the sense of, I kind of like this. I kind of like being in a position, an important person in a government, for example.
Yeah, thank you. Nathan, I'd like to come back to the point on the gaps that you had been writing about in terms of Egypt's legal, constitutional, and institutional arrangements right now. And it seems the picture has been very muddied, not only by these unilateral declarations by SCAF, but now some of these are being challenged in the courts. For example, the administrative court struck down the decree giving broad arrest powers over civilians to the military. There have been challenges to the constitutional declaration, the dissolution of parliament. I think some of those might be postponed until September. Not that, urgent questions or anything, right? So, what I would like to ask you is, but how do you see the courts playing a role in this dispute? How do you think they will treat some of these issues? How independent are they going to be in their decisions? And how might the court's decisions on some of these issues affect the political process going forward?
Well, they've certainly had a big effect so far. I mean, basically disbanding the parliament, and then the SCAF stepped in by not simply having the parliament disbanded, but by saying there won't be new parliamentary elections until the process is entirely completed. So the court decisions have played a big role. In a sense, I think you could say what Khaled and Hafez were talking about was the battle between kind of civilian forces and the deep state. You could almost say this is the battle with the shallow state, right? I mean, the judges do not look as if they're a powerful force, and they certainly don't have the same kind of imposing or opaque reputation that the security forces have. But in a sense, what has been going on, I think, not just with the judiciary, but with some other institutions as well, I think you could say to some extent national media, you could say to El Azhar, some other kinds of institutions, is that these are ones that were for a long time walled off from politics. And they built up sort of a strong sense, a strong institutional culture, a strong sense of their own role. They were accountable ultimately in the last analysis of the presidency, but often the last analysis didn't come, and they were kind of let free to do what they wanted to do. And now there's a little bit of a battle, because what we've seen so far, especially since the parliamentary elections, is majoritarian institutions beginning to try to work. So the battle is to some extent, I think, between kind of these forces that say, look, we're here to represent the permanency of the Egyptian state, the sovereignty of law, not simply the whim of the majority at any particular moment, and that's how the judiciary sees its role, and for instance, a president who says, I was just elected, or a parliament that says, we're the ones who make the law. So that's a conflict that I think is going to be played out, and it's not going to be immediately settled anytime soon. In terms of how independent the courts are, well, I think in terms of their independence from those democratic structures, that's established. They can strike down those democratic structures when they want to. In terms of their independence from say the SCAF, that's much, much harder to trace. And my sense is, and I'm just going to talk about my sense, is that for the most part you do have this very strong institutional culture on the part of the judiciary that sees itself as part of the Egyptian state that kind of often dovetails very nicely with the way that the SCAF sees it, but which doesn't necessarily operate at the beck and call of the SCAF or before him of the presidents. I think you may have, and here I want to express myself very tentatively, but I think you may often have particular judges who are perhaps not acting out of simply a sense of responsibility to the state, but often in response to a telephone call they just received from somebody in a high position. I think that happened in Egypt, but I'm not sure that's what's really the driving force here. And then particularly, I think, you see with the administrative courts and the constitutional courts another factor as well, and that is that these courts realize that they're operating in a political context. For the most part, the judiciary comes out of a very strong kind of positive law, or kind of a civil law tradition that says our job is just to read the text and apply it. The administrative courts, because they have jurisdiction over any case in which the state is a party, obviously are operating in political context, and every single constitutional case is inherently political, and they're dealing with a very kind of vague text. So you look at these courts, and I think the judges in them are often much more comfortable than the rest of the judiciary in trying to, or in seeing themselves as operating within a political context, not necessarily in response to a phone call, but just in a political context, and reflecting various trends that they see within the society. That doesn't necessarily lead in any predictable direction. In the year after the revolution, the administrative courts were basically doing things like dissolving the National Democratic Party, reversing nationalizations, and taking fairly bold judicial decisions that were seen as pro-revolutionary in nature. But so what I think you'll see is, I guess, some pushback from the courts that say we have to defend ourselves against this onslaught. You will probably see, I would guess, a little bit of incoherence in the part of the courts because judges do have different kinds of inclinations. And then you'll also see, as I say, a continued political role, especially for the administrative courts and for the constitutional court.
And if I may add to this dilemma in the judicial issue, is that in the administrative courts you would have judges are supposed to interpret how the enforcement of law different or same as the laws itself. They don't go above the laws. And the Supreme Constitutional Supreme Court, the case of the interpretation of the Constitution. The difficulty and the dilemma is we're not talking about a constitution that had been put 200 years ago. We're talking about an amendment or a declaration, or a so-called the constitutional declaration written by an officer, a military officer, last night. And so nobody who has the authority to say if this is fair or not fair. We don't have someone to say fair or not fair. We have someone to say constitutional or not constitutional. But the Constitution itself, you don't have that authority. And that is the dilemma that we're going to get in until we have a constitution. Egypt is going to have the problem of who can judge if this constitutional constitutional declaration or amendment is fair or not, because none of the judiciary have that power. It is supposed to be the people, and we keep looking for those people to represent the will of the people. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we're going to go to audience questions in just a minute, but before we do, we did have some foreign affairs ground to cover here. Maybe we can get to that in the question and answer period as well. But I'd like to wrap up before we go to the audience with sort of a general question. It's addressed to all three of you, kind of a jump ball. Whoever gets to it first can start. But we've talked about all the uncertainties, all the tensions, all the competing demands for power and influence that we're seeing in Egypt today, which is really beginning to form this next period. I don't know what this next period should be called, though. Can you say, for each of you, that we actually are in the midst of a democratic transition at this point? Is that what is really going on here? And wherever you come down on this issue, looking beyond the period of the Constitution, the next Parliament, whenever it's elected, where do you see Egypt going from that point?
not in the middle, it's just even past the middle of a democratic process. I mean, Egypt is ahead in a real, genuine democratic process, and regardless of the ups and downs that is awaiting them, they already passed the bottleneck. It is already gone, no doubt about it. And thanks also to the seniority and the age group that the military, the SCAF, belongs to. Had we been dealing with a military junta of the 50s of Nasser and his people in the 30s or 20s or whatever, with all respect to age, here I know I did study age discrimination in the US, and I know this is the one that you don't need anything, you can just go to court. But I am saying that thank God that we're dealing with senior officers, that they know that the Egypt cannot take it, and we cannot really tolerate the kind of things that is going on in Syria or might happen more in Libya. For that reason, I think there is a wisdom and an agreement that you will try to push, you will try to bully the others, call their bluff, but you know that nobody is going to resort to violence. And that is very important in order to be really confident about the transition to democracy in Egypt that is already passed and they did go through successfully so far.
As far as where we are in the democratic transition, I would actually put it a little bit differently. I would say that we haven't actually started the transition process. It was supposed to start 16 months ago, and for the last 16 months, we've been doing something else, apparently. But I mean, if you look at it, Egyptians went to the polls 5 times, and 3 of those times the results have been essentially ignored or overturned. And one, the 2 rounds were for the presidency, was in doubt for a while. So, I mean, this isn't an institution, the SCAF is not an institution that respects the popular will. So I think optimistically, if a democratic transition is going to happen, it will probably begin now with the inauguration of the new president. Of course, things can always go wrong. We can go backwards. We can see more of the same kinds of patterns of parochialism and division and infighting that, of course, will strengthen the deep state and the SCAF and sort of this kind of Machiavellian game of divide and rule. We can see a continuation of that, or we can see a very slow process where an establishment, a lot of these corrupt institutions begin to be undone. That said, however, I will say that there have been some very important landmarks. I think the mere fact that you had several elections that were relatively clean is important, but also even in terms of the culture of democracy, that you had a president who got more votes than the other guy, and the other guy conceded. The other guy who was the favorite of the powers that be conceded, professionally and in a way humbly. I think that is an important kind of tradition to establish and strengthens Egypt's very, very fledgling democratic culture.
Thank you. I think, Nathan, you have the tiebreaker in this.
Okay. Yeah, I guess I'm in the middle. If you'd asked me a month ago, I would have answered very similarly to the way that Hafez did. Mm-hmm. And in fact, a year ago, I wrote a blog post called "Don't Worry, Be Happy." Okay, that was my take. I mean, yes, of course, there's noise day to day, but what we're in is essentially what you call the democratic process. Now, I would say I see the democracy. I don't see any process. Right? I mean, this is the most cockamamie and confused. I can't even don't even know what it is. And that is real worry. So that's the first thing. What you have is kind of sort of a political situation in which the basic rules of the game are not clear, are constantly rewritten, and that sort of thing. I still do think, and I think Khaled and I might agree with you here, you do see a more kind of democratic society and culture. There I would point, however, to another sort of mildly worrying sign. And here this is just impressionistic. I mean, I go to Egypt now about every 2 or 3 months or so. So it's a little bit like kind of like time-lapse photography, and it's very superficial, like a kind of political tourism. But each time I see something a little bit different. The first time I went after the revolution was in March, and I thought, if you told me there is a revolution and now Tantawi is head of the show, I would have said, what revolution? But no, when you got there, this was a different society. People talked differently, people acted differently, people interacted with each other differently, people, to some extent, even sat differently, right? It was just a place which really had sort of a revolutionary ethos, even if fundamental relations of political power hadn't changed that much. I see that receding a little bit, because what I saw in, say, the first year after Mubarak's departure was what I call sort of mini revolutions all throughout Egypt's institutions, where you had essentially a wave of activism in schools, in universities, in trade unions, in professional associations, in media, and so forth and so on. Real kind of pressure from below that wanted to replicate some of the rebellion against kind of stultifying corrupt authority. And I think that's lost a lot of its steam. That may be a generational struggle, as you say, and it may just be that it's a matter of having the current generation move on to retirement. But I see those mini revolutions as just a much less powerful force than I had than I saw them a year ago, and to me that's a little bit of a worrying sign.
Well, in any case, I didn't mention process and what I said. I know that knowing from experience that we were hoping in the Arab-Israeli conflict, a peace process, we start with the process and we end with the peace, and we got nothing. So I'm glad that we don't have a democratic process in Egypt. I'd rather have democracy, and I leave process for Dennis and the rest.
Thank you. I've asked questions for an hour. It's your turn. I think we have microphones. I just ask that you stand up, state your name and identification, and keep your question to a question. We'll start here, and then we'll go over there.
Thank you. My name is Saeed Erikat from Al-Quds Daily newspaper. My question to you, Hafez, is once the president is inaugurated, Morsi is inaugurated, how does he govern? I mean, there is no parliament, there is no constitution. What mechanism is available to him? Thank you.
For the time being, it's supposed to be, according to the addendum by the SCAF, the legislative powers are with the military, with the SCAF. They would provide, any minister in the cabinet could propose a bill, send it to the SCAF. If the SCAF would approve it or change in it, it would be sent to the president. The president had the right to veto it, and it would be killed at his desk, or he would pass it and it would be enacted. Other than that, he would have his own power of presidential decrees that he could use with the same limitation of any presidential decrees that previous presidents did have. And he could ask people to do whatever he needs, approve the new budget, change the cabinet members, including the police, interior ministry, which is the main one supposed to be influential for security within the country or inside. So I believe he would act as a president, other than what is left for legislation. But we would be distracted by the writing a constitution at the meantime. The declaration, constitution addendum gave the president, gave SCAF, gave the prime minister, although the prime minister is supposed to be hired by the president. I wonder why did they give the prime minister as well. And judiciary, head of judiciary assemblies, the right to veto anything that you don't like while they are agreeing on articles of the new constitution. But other than that, I don't think any problem of him to rule and to govern the way he would like to do. I mean, I don't see it other than that, yeah.
Can I weigh in on that?
Yeah,
actually,
please.
just very briefly, because this relates to the point that we began with. I see the Mohamed Morsi's role as the new president really being twofold. I mean, he has really two hats when he's coming in as president. On the one hand, there's his governing hat. He's the head of the government. I'm not sure he's the head of state, but he's the head of a government. He will appoint a government. And he has a responsibility as far as governing, at least on those areas that he's not, those files that aren't completely taken away from him. On the other hand, he also has a different role, and I think this is why we're seeing 6 vice presidential appointees and all these negotiations happening, and that is he's also in a way the representative of the people. Perhaps you could even say he is, for better or for worse, he represents the revolution on a certain level, to the extent that it is a revolution, and to the extent that he represents it. Again, I'm really watering down my words here, but in the absence of words that can actually describe Egypt's kind of uniqueness, this is why we're seeing the kind of bean counting, and I do think the optics are important, as long as they're not purely tokenistic. I think people will look to the presidency to see, does it look like Egypt, or does it look like the Muslim Brotherhood, guidance council? What does it look like? And so he has to play that role. He has to be the interlocutor between the street, because the Brotherhood is back on the street, and the SCAF, in addition to governing. And the two roles, I think, are complementary. He can use one to leverage the other, so long as, of course, he has a sound and reasonably broad coalition.
David Mack, Middle East Institute. And my question also, I think, is for Hafez, although welcome anybody else commenting. That is, what do Egyptians expect of the United States right now, government and civil society in this country? Do they want us to stay completely out of Egyptian politics, or put our thumb on the scales in some way? Do they want us to intercede with the Israelis on certain points? What are they looking to Washington for?
Other than it would be nice if it continues this way for the Obama administration, just to be content with to be satisfied with the few statement by the spokesperson of the State Department, as if nothing happened in the history of the Middle East that doesn't deserve Obama to come out to the podium himself and say something, that the first democratic election of a new president came, or whatever, for whatever presidential campaign consideration or reason that kept Mr. Obama silent. It would be nice if he continues this way, for him and for Mr. Romney, because it would have counter effect when you have someone telling you what to do or commenting one day or the other. So, but for practical reason, what the U.S. could do, well, let's go back to the Marshall Plan. I mean, this is what Egyptians would like. If you would like I know that it came, as Nathan said, at the wrong time, and we should have planned it differently. But for whatever reason, that is really the leverage. That's really what really makes it a big difference. It is really, if you could do something in package with the Europeans, with convincing the Gulf states or whatever, so Egypt doesn't have to bargain and negotiate with Gulf states, for example, that for Egyptians might feel that there might be some politics or twisting arms or anything like that. If it comes as a word will, that this is the example that we would like in the Middle East for revolution and the change to happen in a peaceful manner and a democratic way, let's bless that by this kind of a package. I mean, the Egyptians have been waiting and accepting for an IMF loan or only $2 billion. That is not really going to make a difference. I mean, there is a deficit for the new budget of Egypt of about 220 Egyptian pounds billion. So divided by 6, you're talking about too much. I mean, about $40 billion of a deficit. So if economy is the best way, not rhetorics, not statements, not anything, a package that really would make a big difference for Egypt to get through these tough times, because this is what's going to be the maker and breaker, whether it's an Islamist or a secular. If they succeed on the economic level, we would say we are all winners.
I'm sorry, I would just like to add one other thing on the diplomatic front. I think the United States should also do very well to avoid giving the impression that it's now clinging to Morsi, or as it did to Mubarak, or to Tantawi to get its business done. I think the U.S. Embassy and our diplomacy in general is going to have to work a lot harder to build strong relationships with a vast number of parties, and to get out of the embassy and get out of Cairo more, to really see what's going on in the country, and to really show that we're with a broader swath of the people than we have been in the past.
That's true, but I found it also silly for the president to talk to Shafiq, the loser, because it is not the norm. I mean, how many times the U.S. president would call each party the winner and the loser? In what capacity? It was puzzling for me.
I wonder, did they get his number in the UAE when they called him? I'm not quite sure about that. Anyway, let's bundle a couple of questions. We'll take this one in here because I saw you first, and the lady in the middle, and then this gentleman up here.
Dana Marshall with American University. Just another question about the package. For the reasons that have been discussed and are obvious, to have a large package that can get through the Hill at this time, politics, the money, we hope that we won't create a null set of things that can be done. If you're looking at an early harvest of things that can be done to try to move the economy forward, obviously tourism is one of those. That immediately ties in with criminality and security. The question is, on that matter, what can be done realistically to try to convince the world's pending tourists that it's safe to go back?
Okay. And then maybe we'll get that question down there in the middle.
Hi, Rowena from Creative Learning. My question is to Hafez, or to anybody who wants to answer. After 30 years of a regime that pretty much has silenced the media, how do you think Morsi or the Muslim Brotherhood is going to function under the new media? Or better yet, how will the new media function under Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood?
Thank you. And a question up here, and then we'll take turns answering those.
Mohammed Al-Gohari, graduate student at New York University. Actually, I want to quickly touch on 2 points that Mr. Khaled mentioned and Mr. Hafez mentioned too. The first one is about the electoral, the political landscape in Egypt. You said by having more election it become more clear. But I think away from this conflict between the so-called elite, which I think they are the main problem in this country. I think we still have like 50% of people who do not participate in any election that being held after the revolution. We do not know anything about their electoral behavior or how they think about political process. The other thing is, don't you say, this conflict between the deep state and the civil political power? Don't you think that there is a conflict between the SCAF and the deep state? Because I had this conversation yesterday with my boss, at work, and he told me that the SCAF had losing a lot of their power, and they need their institution to be safe and away from any political conflict, and they need to keep their business safe, their political interests. So they announced the victory of Morsi against the desire of the security apparatus desire to announce Shafiq as a president.
Thank you. Who would like to take a crack at the economic question first?
The tourist issue and security, of course, as long as Americans are not keen on their bikinis to go to take it to Egypt, I don't think there is any problem. I mean, the issue is mainly security. I mean, and also even under Mubarak regime or Sadat or before that, Egypt did not do well in developing its tourism industry. I mean, compared to the rest of the Arab world, I mean, Tunisia, for example, with their number of population compared to the visitors, or any other country, or Spain, for example. So there is a lot to be done. And Egyptians are going to look at Turkey, for example, and the Turkish model, since you have a moderate Islamist party that is in power, and what can be taken from them, as well as Malaysia and others. I think based on these restrictions, the restrictive thing that the Erdogan and the Turkish did was just limiting where you could consume alcohol. It's only in licensed places, not in a place that is not licensed to sell. Things like that, very limited things. So what I am saying is that we shouldn't be worried about the tourism is something contradictory to an Islamist or political Islamist president over there, especially the Muslim Brotherhood. We're not talking about the Salafis. We're not talking about the parliament. So a lot could be done, and mainly security. If you would resolve the issue of security, the rest would really come through. I'm sorry, go ahead. Khaled, do you have anything on the economy?
No, okay. The second question we had, which I thought was a very good one, and I actually had it written down here, something similar to it myself. The one on the media and what do you think the media climate will be and the regulations?
Yeah. Today, actually, I was supposed, they called me yesterday to attend a meeting with the president, with the talk show hosts, and the editor-in-chief of newspapers. And there was I talked to some of my colleagues who attended the meeting today with him. Many of them were so optimistic, but still, I mean, it's so far there, you don't have anything to grasp, because he himself, when he would ask about the media, would say, all what I could do is that to follow the laws and enforce the laws in an honest manner. Because this is not the parliament, and we go back to the legislative thing. There were, before dissolving the parliament, there were some bills that could have really made some changes in how the media is doing business over there, especially the ownership, the future of ownership of government newspapers or state newspapers. This is something that if could be dismantled, it would really take a lot from the authoritarian style of regime and would help a lot in Egypt. Freeing the license of frequencies of FM and the terrestrial TV stations. The government TV is still controlling all frequencies of radio. There are some private, but it's only satellite. So all of that has to be dismantled and liberated, but it's going to take time, and it is not going to be the president who would do it. It's going to be the parliament and the constitution, and we are going to be waiting for both.
Okay, thank you.
Can I come in on the,
please.
On the media question? Because I think it actually is fascinating, and I want to answer partly because I think Hafez is being a little bit too modest, and I'll explain what I mean by that. The question you asked about, voices being silenced and so on, I think that's true of the Egyptian media, but I think the revolution in media began a decade ago. It was that monopoly of state truth was shattered, and it was first by satellite television, then by the independent press. This was before the political revolution in Tahrir Square, and the country simply came alive. That old structure still exists, a state-owned media, and so a part of the question is, what do you do with essentially a Soviet-style media in a post-Soviet age that has just kept on, and the question has economic dimensions, right? These institutions absorb or employ all kinds of people. They're very, very expensive to maintain, and so on. And the political impulse is to see who's in charge and how can we suck up to them. And so there's this kind of like dinosaur out there. But that dinosaur's monopoly, like I say, was shattered a decade ago. With the media, the other interesting aspect of the question you asked about Morsi himself, and I'll just give you a personal impression. There are people in the Brotherhood who really learned to appreciate the media, learned to talk to it, actually liked talking to people outside the movement, got very, very good at this, and also began to realize that to the extent they could talk to Egyptian independent media and foreign independent media, they could establish a space for the Brotherhood that the Brotherhood could really profit from. There were people in the Brotherhood who were very, very good at that, and Mohammed Morsi was simply not one of them. Okay? This is a man that I described as cuddly as a porcupine. And, okay, so its personal media style, I think, this is a person who's lived within a Brotherhood environment for a couple decades, and is going to be, my hunch is very uncomfortable. What you described is exactly what I would have expected. Somebody who knew what he had to say, but couldn't say it with charm. And that's going to be the president that you have for as long as he's able to serve.
Okay, thank you. Then we had the other question up in the front.
On the political map.
Yeah,
just
to the deep state.
Very briefly, I mean, of course, you had something like 40% in the first election who didn't participate, and maybe 50% or more in the last round of the presidential race. I mean, that's an issue. On the one hand, though, I'm really referring to the political map to the extent that we know it and can know it. We can't know if people don't vote, what their preferences are. Of course, there are polls, and we all know how effective polling is in Egypt. So to the extent that the political map is knowable, it's been clarified bit by bit over the past 16 months, and I think that's useful. To the extent that the remaining 40-50% will participate in future elections, it will be clarified further.
And also, people learn, I mean, from elections. For example, I'm sure that the new parliament that's going to be elected, if there is no more interpretation of dissolving the parliament, the kind of people who are going to be elected are hopefully going to be different from previously. And we have seen that even in the American society, with all development and all of that, we have witnessed in the 80s all the talk about, and in the 90s, about the moral majority and all of that. And then we found out that some of the Congress people and the politicians of moral majority are already involved in sexual scandals and different things of that shape. And we have seen that in Egypt in the few months that passed for the Salafi, for example. People are lying, people have problems of being arrested for being with the hired girls or whatever. So this kind of experience that even democratically developed societies like the U.S. did go through and is still going through ups and downs with the moral majority or right, religious right or whatever. You have been seeing that. And the more elections shouldn't scare us. The more elections means the more experience to know and to figure out which one that you could choose rightly.
I think we'll have time for a couple more questions. We'll take this one in the front and the gentleman here in the middle, down the aisle.
Hi, my name is Lara El-Sharif. I'm doing my PhD at GW. And I had a question for both Nathan and Hafez. There's something that I've realized that a lot of people keep saying this is the first Muslim Brotherhood president of Egypt. But a lot of people forget that Abdel Nasser was also part of the Muslim Brotherhood movement in the time of the British occupation, and Sadat also at some point in his life was part of the Muslim Brotherhood movement, even if it was just brief times. But how do you think that plays a role in really analyzing whether this is the first real Muslim Brotherhood president of Egypt? Thank you.
Go ahead. All right. Yeah, we'll take that one.
Hi, Alex Bruce, Frontier Strategy Group. I know we had the question before about tourism, but I was just wondering what specific policies can be put in place in the next month or so to reassure investors and kind of bring back a lot of the FDI that's kind of gone out of Egypt in the last year or so. Thank you.
Okay. All right. We'd like to take the first shot at the question.
For Nasser, I don't think that we could consider Nasser as a Muslim Brotherhood, or even a closet Muslim Brotherhood. He did, yes, he did before 1952. He did move from one to the other, tasting them or whatever you can call it, or being acquainted with either both sides on the aisle. I mean, not necessarily. Even the communists did mingle with them, and his name was Maurice, I believe, as a nickname in a communist cell, and then the Muslim Brotherhood and places, as someone, as an officer trying to figure out. And that's why he was politicized, and when 1952 happened, those people they know what they want, and what they wanted is that they hated all political parties, and they had their own model. So that is not the case. And also we have to be careful when we say Muslim Brotherhood. Even the Muslim Brotherhood in their 85 year of being on the scene, they have changed and moved and developed. The Muslim Brotherhood that did go through the 70s did mingle with the university Islamic groups in the universities. And I know that here in the U.S., people are scared of the word. A member of the Muslim group came to Egypt, and how the State Department gave him a visa. We're talking about clubs, university clubs. They called Islamic groups. This is not Sheikh Abdul Rahman or Bin Laden or something like that. When you say a guy was a member of the Islamic group in the 70s, it was university clubs that was been financed and supported by Sadat and the CIA, whether it was Bill Casey or others, for all those to fight against the communists and leftists and Soviet, Russian or whatever. So that shouldn't be the case. So I would exclude this issue of Nasser. The Morsi is someone who's not a charisma, and this is good. I mean, we are fortunate. Yeah, we're really fortunate that we don't have the first choice of Muslim Brotherhood, Khairat al-Shatir. The guy is a successful one. He has huge business with the Turkish and others, and he's the one who's investing the money of the Muslim Brotherhood in a very successful way. Had we got Shatir in, he would say, I know everything, I don't need anyone to advise me, I made it, and this kind of arrogancy that I know it, I know better. And so for this guy is humble and already learned to listen to others, and I believe that's good. That might be a good weakness in him. The question of the, I'm sorry, I leave if Khaled and Nathan would like to comment on this issue of Nasser or the background of the Muslim Brotherhood.
I'd amplify your answer in one way. Yeah, this is different because there were people like Nasser and Sadat who kind of passed through the Brotherhood, like they were going through a stage in their life. It had more lasting effects, maybe in Sadat's case than in Nasser's. But with Morsi, you have somebody who was chosen by the movement, who was on the guidance council, who was the leader of their parliamentary bloc. This is somebody whose heart and soul and has lived within the movement. So it's a very different environment. But I would still say that your mention of Egyptian history is interesting in a very different way than the discussion has gone. When you go back to the 30s and 40s, this was common Egyptian life, right? The Brotherhood was just a normal part of Egyptian society. Then for a long time it was underground. Now it's going to be normal again. One thing I learned over the last year or so, and sort of one of the parts of Egyptian society that I focus on is the judiciary, there are all these judges who, they're not members of the Muslim Brotherhood, but as soon as the revolution happened, they felt a little safer growing their beards, and they're clearly politically leaning in that direction. You're going to see, I think, more of that, where suddenly, if you have a Muslim brother at the top, you're going to have, you may return to this normalization of the Brotherhood that you saw back in the 30s and 40s. So your mention of Egyptian history may be a little bit more of the Egyptian future than our quick answer may imply.
We had the final question on how best the government should proceed to reassure foreign investors and bring back foreign direct investment. Anybody feel expert enough to address that one?
Well, I think they don't need to do anything other than making sure that the kind of corruption that happened wouldn't scare people and doesn't deal with it with a wide brush. It's just to focus with a surgical laser surgery and exactly the kind of corruption that happened and pick some of it, but not in a way that people would feel that really they'd rather move their whatever left of money for them in Egypt out because they are scared of what happened before or this kind of retribution. I believe the Muslim Brotherhood, as people who are already in business and they did business under Mubarak regime, means in some of it is in ways that not necessarily orthodox way or right ways. They understand that. They understand how to deal with business, but and for all reasons, nobody is going really to do something radical in Egypt for the next 1 or 2 years. And the people, once they are assured that there is security and things are going normal and there is no drastic measures taken, it would be fine. And it's going to be the best thing for Morsi to do, and I believe he would do, whether with the deep state or whether with the business people, is the policy that is adopted by the U.S. military. Don't ask, don't tell. So don't go to the past, what happened, and just continue. Yeah.
I see. Well, just to add, I mean, when you say they're not going to do anything radical in the next 2 years, I mean, I assume that applies to their domestic policy, but that probably also to their foreign policy as well, right? Sudden lurches in one direction or another are not very reassuring to
foreign policy with whom? I mean, Libya, Syria. I mean, what?
But also because they won't control foreign policy. They won't control national security policy and foreign affairs in general, and all of that will be maintained by the SCAF. But if I could answer the question on foreign investment. To sort of plug another hat that I wear, I would say 3 words: rule of law. Rule of law is very important in terms of promoting an investment-friendly environment in Egypt, not only because of to widen anti-corruption measures, but to create a predictability in the market, in access to markets, and sort of leveling the playing field to know that not everything has to go through. You have to know someone who can open doors for you, but also in terms of enforcing contracts, basic things like that, to know that there's a legal and judicial environment that is predictable and reliable, that you can go to in order to arbitrate, conflicts and so forth. So, rule of law. If I had one message to the Muslim Brotherhood or to anyone who's going to govern, I would say rule of law is very good for business in general.
Well, thank you very much. We have run out of time. Thank you all for coming, and please join me in thanking our wonderful panelists for a very interesting presentation.